get my 6. Happy Halloween Eve. As of this recording, it is one day before Halloween. We are in the forest just inside the wood line where forest meets field. We're up on a hill, and as you might be able to hear, it's raining. The veil is pretty thin right now. The only time it will be thinner is tomorrow. So, I have a story for you. It's not really my story. It's a story that comes to us by way of Kathy T, who doesn't want her last name known. It's a wonderful story. It is a Halloween story, as well as potentially a Bigfoot Sasquatch story. So you get the best of both worlds. It's a story called Kathy's Halloween Bigfoot Sasquatch Story, and it is part of Bigfoot Sasquatch Files Volume 11, a Bigfoot Sasquatch Halloween special. Okay? So many of you have already read this, but like yesterday, for those of you who have not, you will now get to hear it. And I know that a lot of you who read these things enjoy hearing me read them to you anyway. You've mentioned that, and so I appreciate that. So I figured this is how we'd roll again here this evening, building up to Halloween tomorrow, which is, of course, you're going to get the best story out of this collection. It's a very special story, a lot of good memories, and of course, potentially, Bigfoot Sasquatch. And it's a story that took place on a Halloween night. Yeah. So, best of both worlds. Now, with no further ado, because I don't know how hard it might rain, and I don't want to get stuck in it out here if it comes down hard, I'm going to get to the story, okay? So this is from a letter that was dated August 8, 2021, this year. Dear Kevin, first I want to let you know that I absolutely love your YouTube channel. It is so much of everything we big kids need, but which also seems to be so hard to find. It's a perfect mix of family fun with you and your beautiful wife and your darling son, plus the educational aspects of all the horticultural and agricultural projects you seem to always have going on. I am absolutely amazed at how much all of the trees you've planted over the years have grown. What most attracts me to your channel is your stories. I not only love all the Bigfoot Sasquatch stuff, and yes, I'm a believer, and you'll soon find out why if you keep reading this letter, which I am, but I am particularly fond of the ghost stories you tell. I appreciate the stories of your life experiences. There is plenty of wisdom in those stories if one listens, which I always do, but your ghost stories and your Bigfoot Sasquatch stories are the absolute best. I hope you don't mind me sharing a story with you. Also, should you choose to do so, you have my full permission to share my story with your YouTube viewers. If you decide to put it in one of your books, you have my permission as well. I only ask 2 favors. Please correct any grammar, typos, or spelling mistakes on my part, which I've done, and there wasn't that many. And please do not include my last name. Done. I believe you, as well as most who talk about these things, know how harshly others who do not talk about such things judge those of us who do. Yeah, they call you crazy. As you can tell by my return address, my name is Kathy. However, I did not grow up in Minnesota, where I've lived for more than 20 years now, but in Ohio, not far from the border of your native West by God, Virginia, as you refer to it in your videos. Also, the part of Ohio I grew up in was part of Appalachistan. So, like you, after college, I left, but I'm sure, like you, a big part of my heart stayed behind. I feel especially nostalgic come fall, and super especially so around Halloween. It's always been my favorite holiday, and mostly because of one super creepy experience I had when I was about 13 years old. As a matter of fact, I was exactly 13. I was in junior high, I think they call it middle school now, and my best friend, Tina, and I were going trick-or-treating. We knew it was going to be the last time we'd do it since we were so old, and our parents tried to talk us out of it, telling us we were far too old, but we did it anyway because we had an objective in mind. The home of Mr. Hooper. For you to truly appreciate this story, you must first understand the lay of the land, as it was back then. I'm only a few years older than you, 53 now, and when I was a child, my family and I lived in what was one of the first middle-class yuppie subdivisions in our small town in Ohio. Before this time, most people lived in good old-fashioned neighborhoods. This would have been in the mid to late 70s, though when a lot of farmers were downsizing due to all the government subsidies that were being paid to them to not farm, And some of the older World War II generation who were farmers were beginning to die off, and their children were inheriting farms they didn't want to operate, so they were selling them off to large real estate developers, and thus subdivisions were born. Our subdivision was once part of a huge farm that was known to have an Indian burial ground on it. The old farmer and his wife, Mr. and Mrs. Hooper, actually died in the early 70s, and when they did, their property reverted to their son, the Mr. Hooper to whom I've referred in this story. Mr. Hooper, I'm told, was working in Hollywood. He was never a big star, to my understanding. He was a stagehand by trade, but he was said to be a very good-looking guy, and he occasionally would get small cameo roles, mostly in B-budget films. I guess he didn't want to drop what he was doing in Hollywood to move back to Ohio and become a farmer, so he sold almost the entire property he'd inherited to developers, and hence the creation of my subdivision. However, he did choose to keep the old farmhouse, the house he'd actually grown up in, and about 20 acres of land directly surrounding it. Mr. Hooper finally retired and moved back to Ohio just before I hit my teens. I think I was 10. I remember he was a single man, and though looking back on it now, I would agree he was good looking. At the time, he seemed, well, creepy. I hate to use that word, but it's fitting. Here was this relatively established bachelor, about 60 years old, living out there in that big farmhouse, which all of us kids were convinced was haunted, all alone, and he rarely had company. You'd see him in town every now and then, at the grocery store or at the local burger stand, always getting his meals to go, and he'd always smile and be friendly, but I think it was just knowing where he lived in that big creepy house and how he lived, all alone, that made him come across as creepy. And then there was Halloween. Mr. Hooper's house and land was not directly across the street from the opening of our subdivision. He'd actually set it up to where his house and land would be at the back of the subdivision before he'd sold the portion of the land he'd sold. He did this so that one would have to enter our subdivision and go all the way back into the back in order to reach Mr. Hooper's driveway. He'd actually made his property more private by having hundreds of houses built in front of it, barricading his property from the main road that led to town. If this makes any sense. I'm not sure if I worded this right. Makes perfect sense. You worded it great. But the fact is that when we would be out trick-or-treating as kids, when we were passing on the back street of our subdivision, going door to door, collecting our sweet treasures as we did, we would have to pass by the opening of Mr. Hooper's driveway. It was a very long driveway, about 200 yards long at least. On that first Halloween that Mr. Hooper was living in that old farmhouse, back when I was 10 years old, he'd placed a short note written on a large piece of cardboard at the end of his driveway. The sign was held up by pumpkins, and he'd placed a small light in front of it so it could be read in the dark. The sign read, "I don't have any candy, but anyone who's willing to come knocking can have a pumpkin." "A pumpkin?" me and my friend Tina said, looking at each other with crinkled looks on our faces. We looked up his long driveway, and though it was dark all the way up, you could see that Mr. Hooper had left his porch light on. So, in order to get one of these promised pumpkins, you had to walk 200 yards through the total darkness. There was not a single street light on his long driveway. Tina and I decided not to take that long dark walk, especially just for a pumpkin, and we would later find out that all of the other kids passed on the opportunity as well. The following Halloween, though we were older and bolder, Tina and I decided not to take the same offer Mr. Hooper had made the previous Halloween. We marveled, however, that he'd used the exact same sign from the year before. He must have stored it like someone would a decoration. And yes, I have this. When we were 12, we likewise chose not to go up Mr. Hooper's long driveway, especially just for a pumpkin, and we learned that to date, none of the other children had taken up the challenge either. However, that year we almost did. Tina and I stood at the opening of Mr. Hooper's driveway, and we had the conversation about how that would probably be our last year trick-or-treating, as the following year would see us as teenagers. Again, we did not go, and we would spend the entire year between then and the following Halloween regretting not having gone. As you've probably figured out, the main reason Tina and I decided to go trick-or-treating when we were 13 was because we wanted to finally venture up Mr. Hooper's very long driveway and snag ourselves a pumpkin just so we could say that we had. No one had done it, and we viewed it as a way to become instant local legends. So, on that dark Halloween night of my friend Tina and my 13th year, someone finally strolled up Mr. Hooper's super long and super dark driveway. Tina and I. But we were not out there alone. Getting halfway was easy. We did that just on bravado. But once we'd gotten halfway up Mr. Hooper's driveway, everything changed and all bravado was abandoned. When we heard what clearly sounded like footsteps. We could hear what sounded like someone or something clearly walking on two legs, walking through the dry leaves of the forest about 20 yards off the driveway and into the woods. "Mr. Hooper?" Tina said, and when she did, the footsteps stopped. "Is that you?" Silence. We stood for what was at least a minute, and let me tell you, it was probably the longest minute of my life. And then Tina said, "Let's go back." "No way," I said. "Look." And I pointed to the house with the porch light shining brightly. Turning back now would be like swimming halfway across the English Channel and then turning around and going back because going the rest of the way is just too far. "That doesn't make any sense," Tina said. "It's the same distance." "That's the point," I told her. I'd heard my father use that expression for years. Anytime I wanted to quit something, I'd started. It always worked on me, and I was happy to see that it worked on Tina. After standing for nearly another minute in total silence and not hearing whatever it was we'd heard only moments before, we began slowly walking towards Mr. Hooper's house. Then, once we'd cut the distance to Mr. Hooper's house to about 50 yards, we heard the footsteps again. This time they were not 20 yards into the woods. They were only 10 yards off the driveway to our right, where there were only a few leaves as this portion of the driveway was grass. Tina and I stopped in our tracks, and I couldn't say for her, but my heart was beating so rapidly that had there been more sounds from footsteps, I wouldn't have been able to hear them over the sound of the beating of my heart. "Let's go," Tina said. "Let's go," Tina said, and I didn't disagree with her this time. However, as soon as we turned around and just as we started to run back to the safety of our well-lit subdivision, something huge ran across the driveway only 10 yards in front of us. I clearly remember that whatever that thing that ran in front of us was, it was running on two legs, not four, and I clearly remember smelling a very putrid odor after it ran across, as if it were the scent of the creature following it. Though Tina and I viewed ourselves as big bad teenagers, we both screamed like little girls, and we turned back around and we made a mad dash toward Mr. Hooper's house. We covered that 50 yards in what would have had to have been a time faster than any of the boys on our high school football team could have ran, and just as we were nearing Mr. Hooper's porch, and my logical mind began telling me it had been Mr. Hooper out there, dressed up maybe in one of his old Hollywood character costumes, Mr. Hooper opened his door and was waving us in. Despite the fact that we'd been warned all about stranger danger and everyone had always viewed Mr. Hooper as creepy, we threw all caution to the wind and ran into Mr. Hooper's old farmhouse like it was presenting the safety of our own houses, and I don't care what anyone else might say to the contrary, that night it did. "Did you see it?" Mr. Hooper asked. "Yes," Tina and I said in unison. "What was it?" "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," Mr. Hooper said, and he never told us. Tina and I looked at each other with a look on our faces that these days would be described best with three simple letters. WTF. Mr. Hooper offered to drive us home, but then thought better of it. "Nope, we'll call your parents and they can come get you," he said. "I can only imagine the Monday morning rumor mill should I take two 13-year-old girls home in my car." And that was that. Tina and I called my mother, who came and got us. Mr. Hooper sent us both on our way with pumpkins of our choosing from his sizable collection on his front porch. He let my mom pick one too when she got there. We waited for my mother on Mr. Hooper's front porch rather than inside his house because he said he felt more comfortable that way, and I can't blame him. As we sat under the light of his porch, waiting on my mother, Tina and I pressed him to share his knowledge with us, his knowledge of what he'd seen run across his driveway, cutting us off from the safety of our well-lit subdivision. "Well, I'll tell you," he said, is that the first time I saw one out there, I was about your girls' age, and I was dumb enough to go around talking about it, and I'd created quite the reputation for myself by the time I got to high school. Let's just say getting out of this little town and out to Hollywood was the best decision I ever made. And I'm not going to stink up the life I have back here now that everyone's forgotten about what I'd claimed to have seen almost half a century ago by going around running my mouth about it all over again. That is both the least and the most Mr. Hooper ever said about what he'd seen that night, a creature that Tina and I believe he himself had seen when he was our age. And again, I'll point out that he said that was the first time he'd seen one. I can't imagine how many times during his childhood, before becoming an adult and fleeing to Hollywood, he'd seen others. Our parents teased us hard after that night, but just for a short while. Other things came up for them to tease us about in time, and we did become instant local legends for having dared go up that long, dark driveway and score ourselves some pumpkins. However, whenever we were pressed as to why we were too scared to come back, we lied. You guys must have seen something, some of the kids would say to us. You must have heard something, others would say. What was it? Oh, we just let our imaginations get all worked up since it was Halloween, we would answer. We'd talked it over the night it happened, and we decided we didn't want to get laughed at and heckled out of our little Appalachian town just like Mr. Hooper had all those years before. We were just talking about all kinds of scary stuff, and the next thing you know, we had ourselves too scared to walk back, we'd continue. But hey, we walked up and we got pumpkins, and so far we're the only ones who have. This last would always change the subject, just like we intended it to. Over the years, we'd hear of other kids working up the courage to go up Mr. Hooper's long driveway and score some pumpkins on Halloween night. All of them also had the courage to walk back. None of them ever claimed to have seen or heard anything out of the norm. Mr. Hooper died when I was in college. I remember hearing about it oddly when I'd gone home one weekend, which just happened to be the weekend of Halloween. He'd gotten a very aggressive case of prostate cancer, and he hadn't lasted long. He'd been buried out behind his house in what was a very small family burial plot. His parents and grandparents were buried there, as well as a brother he'd had that I'd never known of, who had died when he was only 3 years old. Mr. Hooper had been 10 at the time. I have to wonder if people thought his claims of seeing what he'd seen had been connected to the grief he was feeling at the loss of his baby brother. It would make sense. For kicks and giggles, and since I was home and it was Halloween and all that anyway, I walked up that long, dark driveway on Halloween night, now no longer a child of 13, but a woman of 21. I found myself laughing aloud when I thought back on that night that Tina and I had gone up the driveway. At 21 years old, I was telling myself that Tina and I had merely seen a black bear, not uncommon in our part of Ohio, and that Mr. Hooper had played it up to be something it wasn't, all in the spirit of Halloween. He was an actor, after all. However, just as I reached the house, and there were no lights on, once again, I heard footsteps off to the side of the driveway. Someone or something was just inside the forest off to my right, and it sounded as if it were walking on two legs. I stopped, looked over to my right, and by the light of merely a sliver of moon, I saw what appeared to be a very large, dark figure leaning up against the side of a tree, as if both hiding and peeking. I did not run, but I did not continue to advance toward the house. I turned slowly and I began walking back out of the driveway, telling myself I was not going to run and that my mind was playing the same tricks it had played on me when I was a girl of 13. But when I got a whiff of that odor, the same odor Tina and I had smelled years before, I took off sprinting. I rarely go back to that small Ohio town because I have no need. I have no family back there, but every now and then I'll attend a funeral of an old friend or of a relative of an old friend. Every time I go back, I drive past the opening of Mr. Hooper's driveway, but not once in roughly 30 years now have I dared to venture up it, especially on dark nights, and especially on dark nights that fall on All Hallows Eve. Kevin, I know what my friend Tina and I saw back in the late 70s, and I know what I saw in the mid-80s. I know what Mr. Hooper saw on more than one occasion when he'd been a child growing up on a farm that was built on land that had been ancient burial grounds for centuries. I know beyond the shadow of any doubt that what all of us had seen, especially on those dark and creepy Halloween nights, was, without doubt, Bigfoot Sasquatch. Your forever viewer, Kathy T., Mankato, Minnesota. So I hope you enjoyed that story. And if you did, I hope you will grace us with your presence again tomorrow for another one. See you then.